So today we thought we would talk about running. It's obviously something that we work in that space quite a bit.
I hear you know a thing or two about it, John.
Well, we'll see. Both in the performance and the injury side of things, it's something that we spend a lot of time working on, particularly in this space. We're working both with athletes coming back from injury, team sport athletes that are trying to return from injury, and even trying to enhance performance. And obviously for those who know a little bit about the clinic, part of what we do is we actually coach and run a sprint group.
Well, and you specifically, I think it's...
Well, I coach them, yeah, but
yes.
I do get a hell of a lot of support from our team here at MAD, particularly on the injury side of things and also on the performance side. So it's not that, I'm doing it on my own. That's definitely not the case. But it's an area that we often get a lot of queries about. People are really interested in our background in that. So we thought we'd take the time today to kind of explore running a little bit more. I think it's important we probably speak about both, steady state running, such as like distance running, as well as obviously, speed and obviously the components that make up the different parts of those.
And I think it's important too, as we were talking about this briefly off the air, of thinking about developing knowledge in running, because in my tertiary education, studying physiotherapy or doing my master's in exercise science, which was focusing on strength and conditioning, I don't think I've had any lectures on running mechanics, come to think of it. Most of that's really come through knowledge that you've brought to my attention.
It's a really big thing that I think has developed, particularly, it's probably been the last 10 years, but it has really exploded, especially in the speed world. Prior to that, I think that there was probably more understanding the understanding of distance running. But there's been some real pioneers probably in the last 10, 12 years, and even Peter Weyand, who was doing a fair bit of work from the early 2000s onwards, which we can discuss more. But essentially, the understanding of particularly faster running has really exploded a lot. And it's not that it wasn't explored before that. Like I remember in one of the courses that we ran, I really liked, there was a great paper by an Italian researcher, Cavagna, who had really good work from like 1970s, looking at the distribution of force output and what contributes between the acceleration and top speed and how it transitions from being a more, muscular driven task or neuromuscular driven task to being a more, elastic, and tendon stiffness driven task as you get into top speed. So the research has been there and it's really exploded in the last 10 or 15 years, really.
When you say research, are we talking about running mechanics specifically?
Yeah, specifically in the biomechanics, it's really taken off. So if we look at the sprint world, people who are interested and probably are starting to look at this from a coaching perspective and also an injury perspective, you got people like Peter Weyand, did a heap of work from the early 2000s, and then from about 2012, 2013, 2014, he started, maybe even earlier, he started working with Ken Clark, and that was when they were at Southern Methodist University in Texas. They started doing a heap of work. For people interested, there's some YouTube videos. It's called SMU Speed Lab videos of them using it.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So they used like a motorized treadmill that allowed them to take force contacts and start giving some better information there. And then there's been a heap of work from JB Moran, probably from sort of mid 2000s. Started looking more into this stuff, and then they had a seminal paper on the mechanical determinants of speed in 2012, where they particularly used. He's based in France, and so they used the study using a French athlete who ran 992, Christophe Lemaitre, and they were starting to see, okay, there's actually some really significant mechanical things that these athletes do when they compared him to runners that were running sort of 10.5, 10.6.
Yeah. Well, actually, that's a question I think I've ever asked you, because the model of running mechanics I've learned is really from what you've taught me. But are there different philosophies of running mechanics and how you get someone to run fast?
Yeah, there's different schools of thought, but you got to put it into context. And I heard a coach talking about this recently, who's one of the top coaches in the world. A lot of people will use what sprint coaches do to develop speed. But you got to remember, they're not coaching pure speed. What they're coaching is the 100 meters or 60 meters. So it actually in itself is its own event. If you're just coaching someone to run at maximum speed, that's not the same as running a 100-meter race and being successful in a 100-meter race.
Sure.
So there's different things that are involved in that. But yeah, so there's a few different schools and a few different, people call it sort of trees of knowledge that they come down. And most of them have, as I said, have been pretty heavily developed through different coaching arms. I know that, like, for instance, the European and even American model is very much biomechanically driven, and the person who's probably driven most of that is a biomechanist by the name of Ralph Mann. The other one that is a coach, but has done a lot of work, and I know that even one of your patients gave you a book to have a look at, is from Tom Tellez, who's Carl Lewis's coach, who he did his master's degree in biomechanics, and so he actually did it on the shot put, but he then started to use that in his work with coaching long jumpers and sprinters at the University of Houston. And he's very heavily influenced a lot of the understanding of, say, the sprint model, or at least the 100-meter model. And there's a whole tree of people that come off him. There's another tree that comes off, say, to Ralph Mann's work. And Ralph was a 110 hurdler, actually, for the US team, and then by trade as a PhD biomechanist. So if people are interested in the actual nuts and bolts of more sprint events and understanding, the different spatiotemporal factors such as like stride length and stride frequency, the numbers you see with that, Ralph's got a number of editions of a book that sort of around sprinting and hurdling. Yeah. So there's that sort of arm. But then when you go to different parts of the world, there actually is some different sort of ideas. And I know that, like, a track coach is one of Australia's top high jump coaches and jumps coaches, Alex Stewart. He spent a lot of time in Japan, and he was explaining to me last year when we were in Japan that the Japanese model is very much around using free energy and falling. So Japan has actually probably done quite well in sprinting, I think, of relative to other Asian countries in the past. We're starting to see a big rise in Chinese sprinting, and a lot of good research comes out of Japan too, related to So the other big research, and I didn't get to this. There's another group is the Basodas brothers that are they're not at the same university anymore, I don't believe, but they're in the UK. And the other one who's an absolute freak researcher and has just done so many really exemplary papers is a guy named Ryu Nagahara, and his research is amazing. So I think he's probably one of the leaders in actually understanding the sprint mechanics and the way that they've done it, which is probably, I think, the fairest way in which to get a clear view on what's happening with sprinting is to look at overground running. So at one of the universities, I don't remember which one it is actually, but they've got, I think it's about 50 meters of force plates sort of back to back. So they were able to see like that full sprint acceleration and into that top speed phase and understand, okay, exactly what's going on. And their work has similarly shown what JB Moran's work did, which was that, the people who create the highest horizontal impulses through their acceleration tend to hit higher top speeds. So understanding like achieving maximal speed in sprint events or even in team sports, field sports, is about actually having a very effective acceleration pattern. So it's like one sets up the other. And people who come from like the more strength and conditioning background would understand that it's like, if you want to be powerful, you need to have a good foundation of strength. If you don't have that background, you're probably not going to be able to develop really, really high levels of power. Even if you've got, say, good velocity capabilities in terms of your contractile and coordination factors. When you look at top speeds, if you can't accelerate well, you tend not to be able to generate really, really high top speeds. And it doesn't mean, put that in context, because it's always the issue that you have is, it doesn't mean that you're fast early. And what I mean by that is, like, it doesn't mean that you're the first person to get to 10 meters or 20 meters, but you can continue to accelerate. Your speed continues to rise. That's actually a question I was going to ask. So thinking about, say, like a 100-meter sprint where you're typically going to be accelerating to what 50, 60 meters? Yeah, so the top athletes in the world, if you look at particularly the females, are probably 5 to 10 meters earlier than the males, and they usually hit their peak between sort of 50, 55, then to sort of 60, 65. Some will go 65, like from 60 onwards, if they've really got their acceleration pattern down pat. And then the males are usually from like sort of 60 to 70 or 65 to 75.
Yeah, okay.
And then they're decelerating after that, and you're trying to minimize the amount of deceleration that occurs.
With field-based athletes you work with in the past, do you use a similar model then in terms of developing their speed? Or because I just think of straight away with field-based athletes, they come up right pretty quickly. Is that actually just a bad habit, or is that also reflective of the?
There's two factors in that. So like if we break this down, if you look at acceleration, and it's like the paper that I brought up from Cavagna from the 70s, as I said, acceleration is very heavily neuromuscular driven. And what I mean by that is you actually need to contract your muscles. You need to push. It's very much a pushing action. So it's not it obviously does use the stored elastic energy that you create, but not to the same extent that what happens in the top speed phase. And the simple reason is that when velocities are low, you need to generate momentum, and the amount of time you have on the ground is much longer. So in that phase, you're actually needing to contract as well as use whatever stored elastic energy you've got. Once you're at top speed, the top athletes in the world are doing 5 strides per second. The contact times are generally between 0.08 and up to sort of 0.1, 0.11, 0.12, right? 0.12 would be a slow contact time. So if they're doing 5 strides per second, that means that their whole stride from contact is only taking 0.2. If you understand basic physiology of muscle contraction, you know that that's considered part of the early RFD phase, like rate of force development phase. You actually don't have time to access the high levels of contractile force because you're not going to get time for the coupling to occur, right? So it's not I'm contracting and I'm trying to push off the ground at this point. What you're doing is you're using the velocity of the limb and the speed in which that limb is actually contacting the ground to stretch the structures, right, and create a nice stable enough platform in which to create tension within connective tissue structures, within across the chain within the tendons, and then bounce off those as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and that obviously when you think about the elastic function, that's why being able to utilize ground reaction forces, that's really essentially where the force is coming from, and how much you can utilize that or store that within your connective tissue system.
Those papers, and I'm sure that predates the papers that they did, but to put it in context, like the work that Peter Weyand and Ken Clark demonstrated, which I think was probably, it's not seminal in the sense that there were other people already looking at this kind of work and understanding, okay, the actual ground reaction forces are much larger than what we initially thought. Like even for jogging, it's 3 times body weight.
Yes.
Right, at a ground reaction force. And Peter Weyand showed that it was close to 4 to 5 times in elite sprinters in, I think it was year 99 or 2000. And everyone interpreted that really wrong, because they talk about mass-specific force. And they interpreted it wrong. Everyone thought, let's just get really, really strong. We've got to deadlift and squat 3-4 times body weight. And it kind of broke a lot of people. And that's exactly what we spoke about just there. Like, you can't create the force that quickly if it's in a voluntary contraction. It has to come from that ability to use that stored energy.
And it's also reflective too of what we know about dynamic muscle architecture, because as you start to increase the velocity of movement, the behavior of the muscle and the tendon decouple. And so it's like you said, the muscle doesn't actually have the capacity to generate that force.
No.
Its role is more about actually controlling and coordinating the storage of elastic energy potential into the connective tissue system.
Yeah, there's a coach, as again, one of the top coaches in the world, Randy Huntington, he always talks about the fact that, the muscles are, repositioning the joints so that you can be in an advantageous position to use your tendon and connective tissue structures. Yeah. Right? It's not you're using your muscle to actually propel yourself once you are up. But if you go back to the acceleration, in the acceleration, you actually have to create momentum. So you need to push. So if we talk about the question you asked about, like you see with field sport athletes, there's 2 factors in it. Sometimes it's that they don't have the physical capacity to actually create power in that direction, particularly that coordination of, horizontal and vertical forces at the same time. But a lot of the time, it's that they actually have not learned the skill of accelerating, which means that they actually need to learn to push in that direction. And you can obviously do that in lots of ways. Many people are starting to cotton onto this, and the strength and conditioning world has really taken off in terms of developing speed. And there's a lot of these speed experts that we see that are spending time in this area. And it's important because if you look at, say, field sports, I don't remember the author exactly, but I know that, say, for instance, in soccer or, European football, whatever you want to call it, there's a really high proportion of game-changing moments that come from speed events. Goals being scored, goals being saved, moments that actually change the game. And I think that that's pretty universal across all of the field sports. Some sports take it really seriously. Look at NFL. Within their battery of testing, they do a 40-yard dash because they see that that's really valuable. In other sports, I don't think it's as valued as highly, even though it probably has a similar influence to what you see, like in that study on soccer.
Why do you think that's the case?
I think because for the longest time, it was difficult to measure, it was difficult to change, and it was really difficult for people to understand that you can make significant change in that area.
Do you think part of it's cultural too?
Very much so. In Australia, yes, because we have this problem even within sprint coaching. So I think that there's a big failure in sprint coaching in Australia because we have, and there's a lot of coaches that don't believe this, but the general philosophy is that Australians are hardworking people. So we hate the concept and the idea that you can get better at something by not working that hard. We almost see it as culturally as a cop-out.
Well, is that also reflective on what you define as hard, though, too?
Yes, because, a lot of people ask me why I enjoy coaching the sprints. And I say to them because they're difficult to improve, right? And they don't get better just by working hard. And that's the thing that people don't get. And I always use, and I don't even know where this quote comes from. I've heard it quoted to lots of different sources, but, people can check this and tell us where it comes from. But it's a lot harder to improve the function of a pencil than it is a tractor, right? In a simple task, the complexity comes because it is simple. So to me, that's the challenge of how do you make something that's relatively simple improve compared to something that takes a long period of time. Well, there's obviously lots of opportunities to improve. Something that's really complicated, say like a field sport, there's obviously millions of areas to change. So that in itself, to me, is the challenge, and that's what I find interesting about things like the 100-meter sprint. Because people go, well, the gun goes, you just run as fast as you can. And clearly we know that there's a lot more to it than that for the people that are involved in it. But that's the interesting part to me, is that it is difficult to change. For the longest time, and you still hear this, speed is, inbuilt. And the truth is that, yes, there's always going to be a significant a part of sprint ability portion to genetics, right? However, that doesn't mean that everybody can't get faster. The level you get to will ultimately suggest that maybe you're not going to make, an Olympic team, but it doesn't mean that you won't improve significantly. And there's multiple ways to do that. As we said, there's a big biomechanical factor, and particularly there's big factors in relation to the physical qualities that you need to be able to move fast. So they kind of go hand in hand.
You touched on this a little bit, but I'd be interested to hear more in detail your thoughts. How does strength, and tied in with this to an extent, muscle mass, fit in with improving sprinting capacity?
It depends, because you tend to get a couple of different profiles in sprint events, particularly sprints, jumps, hurdles. You tend to get the more muscular type, so people who put on muscle easily. If you want to look at the traditional phenotypes, you're looking at someone who's like a mesomorph, compared to someone who's more of like that real ecto sort of greyhound type. And those people tend to use very high limb speeds, and that they have very good ability to control, things like tendon stiffness qualities and elastic function and bouncing. So for them, muscle mass becomes in a lot of ways protective for their tendon structures.
Yeah, okay.
And we've heard, for those people who are interested, and I would really encourage people to look at this, the researchers say like Keith Barr, talks about this for those elastic types, you actually need to have some muscle hypertrophy going on because it becomes protective for their tendon structures.
And you think that's more the benefit for them as opposed to their performance?
Yes, I think what it does is it allows them to lay longevity. Longevity allows them to lay down, say, connective tissue structures. Whereas in the more muscular type, you're always trying to drive them toward more elastic behaviors, right? Because they're usually strong, they're usually powerful, but they actually don't have the contractile speed. They don't hit the ground with the same ground reaction forces. They can, but often, and you find with those ones, they end up having a drop off in their ability to maintain speeds because their elastic function is not the same.
Do you see those two profiles associated with certain qualities in where they perform best in running, like acceleration versus high velocity or max velocity?
Generally, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Generally, yes. Like your more muscular type, as we spoke about, is going to benefit from that contractile time and the time on the ground. So they tend to be better accelerators, whereas the ones who have that more greyhound sort of, profile and are elastically, well coordinated, they tend to be able to have really high top speeds and maintain speed for a really long period of time.
Yeah, okay. So because I know you've mentioned to me before that a lot of coaches will often question the value of resistance training for sprinters.
Yep.
Do you think part of the response or the actual understanding this problem is more based on the profile and whether you're actually using resistance training to enhance performance or actually mitigate injury?
Yeah, definitely. So I think, and this will also build into, obviously, we'll talk about distance running because there's one of the top coaches, Dan Pfaff, talks about, he's like, distance runners are allergic to steel. They just don't want to go near the gym at all.
Why is that? Do you think,
cultural? It's very cultural. And it's even like, some of the same bullshit you hear even with, say, female athletes going in the gym, like, oh, you're going to get bulky, you're going to put on muscle. And we've spoken about this previously, but the molecular pathways for developing, muscle mass is it's in contrast to what you're getting from, say, your distance training. And therefore, the amount of stimulus you would need to do in regards to resistance training would need to be so high for you to put on a significant amount of muscle mass with all the distance training that you're doing. So that's a moot point. But yeah, culturally, there tends to be some issues with it. In Australia, if you contrast, say, Australia with the US, who are very comfortable having younger people go into the gym, particularly because of their involvement in things like, American football, they're very happy for the kids to start learning to go into the gym at 12, 13, 14 years of age. Whereas here, we tend to have a real issue with, kids going into the gym before the age of maybe at least 16. And it's a real issue. And I think it's even, like I just brought up the issue with, say, female athletes. I think that's even mitigated, that's expressed even more. We spoke with Megan about, the issue that you see in young female athletes going into field sports and the increased risk of joint injuries. For them, strength training, and particularly well-coordinated strength training and resistance training, is very protective for their joints. It's very protective for their, muscle tendon structures. It develops their ability to land, jump, and it's not that it creates all of the factors they need, but it's foundational for them. And so the fact that we're now starting to see younger female athletes in the gym earlier, we're going to hopefully see less of these injuries occurring. It's not going to completely eliminate them, but we hope that it starts to change that conversation.
Yeah, I agree. And I just wonder how much of it requires a cultural shift. Like how much of it is this kind of belief that, one, you're either going to get super bulky and that seemed to be aesthetically unappealing, or that's not for me, so to speak.
Yeah. And look, I probably didn't answer your question too. It's made me think of an example. The issue you have with those more elastic profile athletes too is it's not the thing that gets them to run fast.
Yeah.
So the issue that you face is they're probably not stopped from participating at a high level by not going into the gym or not doing an extensive amount of gym. The problem then, though, is that it's a balancing act, because often a lot of gym work for those athletes, it's very taxing for them. So you can then sometimes even increase the injury risk because of fatigue.
Yeah.
But for them, it's very much protective. And it's interesting, the issue that you have with some of them is that they'll have more injuries in the long term because they actually haven't developed some of the properties they need to protect their tissue.
Yeah, well, actually, that's a question I was going to ask you. I don't think we've talked about this before, but if you're a sprinter and you're spending most of your time on the track, how much structural or peripheral adaptations are you going to get? Like, do you actually get enough time under tension to see changes to the actual characteristics of the density of the tissue? Like, or do you actually need resistance training to actually be able to amplify the amount of mechanical tension? And therefore,
you're saying in regards to hypertrophy, you're talking in terms of other structural?
Well, yeah, I think probably the whole myofascial system. Like, I mean, obviously,
you get really significant changes to your myofascial system from chronic sprint training application.
Do you see hypertrophy as one of those elements? Do you think it's more to the connective tissue system?
Yeah, I do think you will get hypertrophy because there is still a very large utilization of large motor units. Mm-hmm. And you typically just see it anyway. You'll see a lot of athletes, and again, this is obviously an observation that you make, but a lot of athletes, and not all of them, but a lot of athletes you'll see they'll actually develop a significant amount of muscle mass without actually going into the resistance training. Yeah. So I do think that it has enough of a potent stimulus.
Well, I think in my experiences of doing sprinting, if you can call it that, like I've experienced quite a bit of DOM. So
yeah, it's extremely taxing when you try and run really fast. People probably don't recognize that, especially if you work or involved in, say, a team sport, because typically most of those athletes are never really going as fast as they can. They might be accelerating as hard as they can, but they're not typically holding a maximal speed for very long at all. And that's one of the things that I think is changing in the preparation of these athletes. Yeah. Like I think I may have brought it up in one of our discussions previously, but it was one of the ideas that, and he's actually injured this year. So, we'll see whether that's part of it. But, in rugby league, one of the Manly players, some of their preparation staff, suggested, okay, let's start exposing them to more speed and maximal speed running and the volume of maximal speed running to be protective for, say, hamstring strain, because he had a history of hamstring strain injuries. And what they actually found by analyzing the GPS data was, well, he's not hitting anywhere near his max speeds in the game, or if he is, he's not doing very much volume of it. And so over time, if we're not exposing him to that in the training setting, like a certain amount of very high speed running, he's actually losing some of the capability, and some of that, say, protective factors within the connective tissue is probably diminishing.
Yeah, that seems to be a bit of a problem in maybe more in sports medicine, of being apprehensive to get athletes to run at high velocity speeds. And like I even think about some of the GPS data where often the highest category...
They set the actual category too low in terms of
like
24 kilometers an hour. Yeah. Some of them it's a little bit higher, but even 24, even 27 kilometers an hour, that's...
Even like for some of those athletes,
that's striding. It's not fast.
Yeah, they can run a lot faster than that.
Well, if you think about it, the top, say, field sport male athletes are hitting, say, 10 meters per second, which is 36 kilometers an hour.
Yeah.
And for them to be running at 27 is very comfortable.
Yeah.
It's nowhere near the threshold that we would even use to say we're starting to hit speed, which is probably around 90%. Yeah. So for them, they'd need to be running, what's that? Take 3.6 off, 32.4. That would be a minimum that I would set is over 90% of their, maximal speed.
Yeah, and it's something that I think needs to probably be done better. And I'm sure in some
it is being done. So there's a lot of work, and even if you look at the work of, say, what's his name? Is it Nathan Heaney, who did a lot of the work on MAS running?
Okay.
His work got more and more sophisticated with developing the understanding of, okay, well, we need to work out their speed, then work out what their speed reserve is, and then actually when you set their maximal aerobic speed, you're actually doing it based off not only what they can hold, but just maximum speed that they can run at. Because if you set it at a pace for someone who's really slow, for them it's a lot more taxing than someone who is very fast, because they've got so much more in reserve.
You'd also think that they would be reflective in the kind of style of play that they have. The fast twitch profile person's probably going to do a lot of walking or slow jogging interspersed with some very high velocity sprinting versus, the more slow twitch
Slogging
person.
it out, yeah.
So you would think that you'd also need to structure their training accordingly, where the volume is going to be relative to that person's ability, but more importantly, what are the speeds in which they're actually...
Yeah, and I think that that's happening in the better, setups. I think it's not happening in some of the setups, even though they're elite settings, they're not, they're not the best.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's something that I think will continue to change.
Actually, just made me think of... I can't think of the author's name, a paper published last year or the year before out of Australia, looking at certain physical components related to muscle architecture. There was one study where they found that the biggest factor was related to the chronicity of doing max or velocity running speeds over 90%.
Yeah.
So it's reflective of, again, creating structural changes where they have longer fascicle lengths.
Yeah, and, like Ryan Timmons did all their work on fascicle lengths. And
I think he was a co-author in that.
Yeah, and I don't think he's against this, but you don't need to be in the gym to try and create that.
Yeah.
Obviously anything that's asking your tissue to create force at a long length is going to, and particularly, as you said, if there's a high chronicity of it, it's going to force that tissue to have to create sarcomeres in series.
Yeah.
Right? It wants to get longer because it needs to change where the position of strength is, and where it can create force.
And because of the shortening velocities, like even if it's not going to change length a lot, it's going to have to contract very quickly.
Exactly.
Yeah. With that in mind, do you think that you can utilize other settings, whether it be like in a gym or I think of any others off the top of my head, where you can replicate high velocity sprinting? Do you think that really, if you actually need to build that quality, you need to be on the...
It's very hard. It's very, very hard because the issue that you face is the exposure to ground reaction forces.
Yeah.
And, like if you look at, like even, we're lucky here, we've got something like a curved treadmill, which I think is as close as you can get, but it's not the same. The ground reaction forces aren't the same.
Yeah.
Right? They're just nowhere near the same. A lot of people, when someone can't run outdoors, they'll use treadmills, they'll use water running, all of those kind of things. And it's good because it replicates, say, the limb velocities and the action is similar and the sequencing, but you just can't replicate actually hitting the ground really hard and moving really quickly through time and space. Because that's the other part that people probably dismiss without thinking about it, is the perceptual effect of actually moving through space at 10 meters per second. There's a lot that goes on, and there's a lot of perceptual things that need to happen for you to be able to control. Like I know that, like an influence on me, which I'm sure some of you have heard me say before, but is Dan Pfaff, and he often says, like it's very different doing, say, abdominal strength training compared to being able to maintain a good posture through your abdominal and thoracic cage while moving at 10 meters per second.
Yeah.
They're very different things.
And this comes back to something we've talked about before of understanding the relationship between tissue capacity and biomechanics, where obviously you can build regional tissue capacity in, say, resistance training, but how much that will then create biomechanical changes. Sometimes it might be more instantaneous because you develop new neuromuscular patterns based on essentially having more tools to solve the problem. But part of it is also how you actually then integrate that into the mechanical requirements of the task you're doing.
Yeah, and that makes me think of, I think we've discussed it at some length, but we'll probably discuss it more when we can do some of that now, is, that concept of that biointegrity.
Yes.
Which is something that actually comes from architecture and, Buckminster Fuller. And it's, the idea that tension, the way that the human body functions is through a series of, tensioned,
essentially stabilization comes through tension through the myofascial network, as opposed to this idea of compression of the skeleton through gravity.
And that in itself, I think, is really important, because what that tells us is why we actually see changes from region-specific, say, resistance training then be observed in biomechanical tasks.
Yes.
Right? It's not and you can make those changes potentially through biomechanical retraining and the exposure to, say, new skills and different tasks and how you set that up. And we can talk about that, actually. We'll talk about that at some point of, like, in this talk about, changing people's running mechanics. But, yeah, like, you may actually see, say, if you start to strengthen around someone's hip, a change in how much, say, drop that they have or pelvic drop, because they've actually learned how to create a more effective utilization of tension throughout that whole system. And it's an important concept, I think, because it shows you why utilizing something like the gym is useful from a biomechanical standpoint.
Yeah, I was thinking before when I asked the question about replicating sprinting in a resistance training environment, and I even think of, say, something like plyometrics, where although you can start to develop some relatively high ground reaction forces,
the contact times
are actually just too long. Because even with, I think, of like depth jumping, we might be getting someone to do 0.15 to 0.2 milliseconds.
Yeah, and that's the challenge that you are constantly having to play with, is that in order to replicate it, you need to do specific tasks. And it's very hard to do that unless you're having contact times that are the same. You can, as you said, with plyometrics, you can easily hit the similar ground reaction forces. But it's also, there's a skill component to that as well. And that was actually demonstrated in some of the papers that Wayans and Clark did, where they actually showed that the function of a ground, or the structure of a ground reaction force, if you look at the tracing, it doesn't use simple spring mechanics. It's not just this nice, like, nice shape, parabolic shape. It actually has a big spike at the top, and then it'll drop, and then it will have that parabolic shape. So what you actually see, and this is what the conclusion was, is that people who run really fast, comparing to people who don't run fast, those people actually learn the skill of accelerating their foot aggressively into the ground on a stiff leg. Whereas people who don't run as fast, they just try and use that, parabolic bouncing kind of action of their tendon structures.
Yeah, and that was something that I remember was an epiphany to me when I realized that for really elastic people, it seems almost contradictory to think that if you jump from a higher box, for a really elastic person, they will be able to jump higher when they hit the ground, as opposed to like jumping from a lower box. And you think, how does that actually make sense? Like, isn't there more gravity, more acceleration down to the ground that's going to pull you down the ground? It's like, yeah, it is, but they actually know how to utilize.
They store that into their structures.
Yeah. And that was something
and you even notice that with really good people who can really jump, and you see it in like drop jump tasks. We get the fortune of working with and have tested some of the top jumping athletes, like long jumpers in the country. And when they actually do that task, they attack the ground. Like they're trying to put more force within their, Achilles tendon, within their, the patellar tendon, the whole chain, across their lower limb. They're actually putting more force than, they really, like, you see them that attack. And they're trying to get as much into it. And that's obviously, part of that is coordinating that skill of doing it. And that's what running fast requires. It's not passively just allowing your foot to hit the ground and bounce off it.
Wow.
You want to run fast, you actually have to attack it, because you're trying to store as much of that kinetic energy within the elastic structures.
It makes you have to question and be critical, and this is probably more related to distance running, but this idea of soft foot landings, in terms of being protective to injury.
Yeah, so it's potentially one of the dumbest things you can say to someone. It's the same with soft landings in jumping.
Yeah.
Right? The reality is, and we know this anyway, and I know that you've actually shared with our group some of these papers, but the actual, there is a difference between what actually happens within the tissue and the actual ground reaction force. And the forces that are actually applied to the tissue they're not one to one.
Yes.
Right. And they're often actually not that well correlated. So it's not to say like, if you have soft landings, you're going to have less, say, bone stress injuries within, say, a tibia for a distance runner, because it's not actually how it works. It's not linear in that sense.
Well, and not to mention, a lot of the bone stress comes from the actual tension within the fascial network, which comes from contraction too.
Exactly, and that's what those papers suggested, is that actually a lot of the development of those bone stress comes, as you said, from the actual pulling of that tissue on its attachment, not on the actual ground reaction force itself. So hitting the ground hard is probably not going to make any difference.
Well, and this is where I think we need to utilize understand the biotensegrity model better, because I also wonder how much does, say, peak bone stress have to do with either just one, lack of tissue capacity and therefore an inability to be able to distribute tension throughout the whole fascial network, or two, a region-specific deficit that causes a high concentration of load within that particular area where they develop a stress fracture.
Yep.
But it's also something I thought would be good to talk about too, is thinking about, this is related both to high velocity sprinting or running, of this idea of optimal running mechanics, but we're currently seeing a bit of a trend of different types of running styles, one being like soft landing or another being running more on the toes.
Yeah,
or
like
the
midfoot,
heel.
rear foot striking.
Correct. What do you make of all this?
So I'm probably in the camp of people who thinks that there is a more correct way of running. People will argue, it doesn't matter. It's not, to me, it comes down to a couple of factors. The biggest one being that what you need to do, in my mind, is coordinate the movements so that you have the opportunity to disperse forces across as much of your tissue as possible, right? Because the more you do that, the more opportunity you have for storage of elastic energy within the connective tissue structures. If you try and limit that by changing, say, where the point of contact occurs, you're potentially taking away opportunity for performance, but you're also increasing, as you said, the concentration of where, say, a particular tissue may be, concentrating on a bone structure or its attachment, or an overload to a particular tissue, because it's actually isolating that tissue to actually do a task. And if you look at all of the papers on this, if you increase your cadence and it, by becoming more of a midfoot striker rather than a rear foot striker, or just increasing your cadence in general, it changes your force distribution or injury risk. Well, the problem is then you're sometimes, robbing Peter to pay Paul. And what you're doing is taking away someone's performance capability just so that you can reduce injury risk. And in my mind, I think that that's a poor way to actually address the problem. As you mentioned, there's a couple of factors that go into, say, the development of injuries. And biomechanics is clearly one of them. To me, the biggest thing with how you run and what you're trying to do is, and it's not that everyone will look the same, they won't. That's what the difference is between, say, someone's, style, right? The idiosyncrasies that they have, and the reason that happens is we have different limb lengths, we have different, as you said, like tissue capabilities. So people will look different, but what they're trying to achieve should be similar. So in distance running, particularly, in my mind, I'm always encouraging people to use as much of their foot surface as possible, right? Because you're not trying to accelerate, right? So the amount of horizontal force that you're trying to create is...
you don't need to be so much on your toes, you're saying?
Yeah, so obviously, if you're trying to accelerate, you need to generate forces in opposite directions you're going. You need some horizontal force application. So that means that your shin angle needs to be more acute, and that means that you're likely going to need to be more on the ball of your foot or the midfoot in order to create some of that horizontal motion. If you're running at a steady state, you're not trying to accelerate or decelerate. So although the midfoot may be the first point of contact, you're probably going to use the whole structure, because what you're trying to do is maintain the ability to continue bouncing for as long as possible, so you can maintain the momentum that you're creating. Now, if you're going up a hill, it's different. If you're really fatiguing, you may need to think about continuously accelerating, creating a little bit more horizontal force. But generally, you should be able to bounce along at the same pace as long as you're not fatiguing too heavily by utilizing those elastic structures. And in my mind, and we've always spoken about this, the human body is not a machine. So to use the idea of, mechanics rather than just biomechanics and say, from a basic engineering point, it's not 100% correct, but I still use this analogy that if you're going to use something as a foundation for where you're going to create contact, you want to use as broad a base as you possibly can. Why would you voluntarily choose to use a smaller portion of that unless you want to concentrate force in a particular direction, or you want to isolate a particular tissue? Now, you can't avoid that in acceleration because you have to. If you're pushing vertically and you're trying to go horizontally, it's not going to work. But in distance running, that doesn't make any sense. So you can actually continue to land on, particularly using your whole foot, because what you're trying to do is use the elastic energy. And it's even an argument in top speed running. You often hear is like, should the heel touch the ground? Right? Are you trying to maintain your heel off? Right? And I always remember listening to a podcast early on when I started coaching of Tom Tellez, who coached, probably the best top speed athlete in history, Carl Lewis. Obviously, the other one's Usain Bolt, but Carl Lewis was always admired for his top speed and particularly for his running mechanics. And I just remember Tom saying, and he's always very adamant, he's a very animated character, but it's, so like the heel always touches the ground in sprinting. He's like, people say it doesn't, but it always does. He's like, slow the video down. And I'm talking at top speed.
Okay.
All right. It always touches the ground, even if it's brief, but it always touches the ground.
Have you tested that?
Oh, yeah. Athletes, and you can voluntarily not do that.
Yeah.
But again, it's a similar thing. Once you've reached top speed and you're trying to maintain that and you're trying to utilize elastic energy, why would you be limiting the amount of stretch that actually occurs through, say, the foot and ankle complex? You want that stretch. You don't want to limit it by locking your ankle into some sort of plantar flex position and not allowing your Achilles tendon to stretch at all.
Yeah. That's
actually disadvantageous, which is why I'm saying if you're a distance runner, you want to have a little bit of that stretch. You don't want to lock and stay on the ball of your foot, because all you're going to be doing is asking your calf, Achilles, plantar fascia to do a hell of a lot of isolated contractile work. And what you tend to find is people who shift more towards that, running on the ball of their foot, they tend to end up with calf problems, Achilles problems, plantar fascia. The ones that go really heavily on their heel, they tend to increase the amount of, say, shin loading because it creates really high peak forces through the actual shin on ground reaction.
Yeah. I also just imagine too, if you're staying on your toes, it's harder to maintain active ankle stiffness.
Of course, because it's more muscular contraction rather than actually doing it through that connective tissue structure.
So, thinking more about distance runners, you'll typically, in terms of thinking about optimal running mechanics for a distance runner, you'll typically see them make that whole foot contact. You'll typically see a bit more of that front cycle mechanics too. Not saying that they don't cycle backwards, but is that also because they're just utilizing their hip more?
You're saying in distance runners?
In distance runners. Like for good distance runners, do they utilize more hip to generate force relative to a poor distance runner?
Yeah.
Not relative to sprinters.
It's a common problem that you'll see is that in distance runners who say like a novice or an intermediate runner, you'll see that they tend to not use their hips in terms of a lot of the force generation. And when I say that, like, they tend to also not be able to use those connective tissue and elastic structures well. So what you see is they actually, it's effortful. They're actually trying to, again, push themselves continuously. Whereas you watch really good distance runners, and the word I always like to use is like they sort of just bounce along. It's like it's no effort at all. And the general thing is it really probably isn't a lot of effort. And that's obviously the concept of running economy, right? And what they've done is they've developed both very high, VO2 mechanics. And so the amount of air, oxygen that they're using, for the speed that they're running at is low. But that's also because they've actually learned to use their elastic structures really well. And so they're getting a lot of free energy almost from the kinetic, from the kinetic energy stored within their elastic tissues.
Yeah.
It's about how you coordinate that and how you land. So the problem that you have with, particularly say if you're someone who's a heel striker, one of the problems that you have from an energetics point of view is that it often leads to people landing further ahead of their center of mass. And so their shin is slightly pointed away from them. And what that leads to is
more
braking forces. And so you see them, they have to absorb that braking force, which often means that they'll bend more at the knee and hip to actually absorb that. Then they have to wait until they're over their center of mass, and then they have to project themselves. So they're actually using more muscular structures, and they're also then having to use more energy to create that muscle contraction rather than being able to use that stored elastic energy if they were landing sort of more vertical, and their shin being more vertical and closer to their center of mass.
I think the last thing that'd be good to talk about is thinking about the utilization of resistance training in distance runners, which we briefly mentioned before and we've talked about previously, because contrary to probably popular belief, its actual utilization for performance is quite massive in distance runners.
It's huge. As I said, culturally it's not utilized enough, but it's massive, because what it's going to do is improve the running economy, like a lot of the running economy factors.
Yes.
It means that you don't need to use oxygen in order to actually create some of the movement that you want to be able to utilize. So essentially you can run at a higher speed and use less oxygen. And that means for a distance runner, that's enormous. It means you're not having to try and drive increased VO2 mechanics through slogging lots and lots and lots and lots of running.
Yes.
Right. And, threshold runs that try and drive up VO2 and, lots of kilometers to try and increase your long run. And not that those things aren't super valuable. You obviously want to maximize on both. You want to have extremely high VO2 and you want to have really good VO2 mechanics and you want to have really good recoverability and have a high threshold for where your lactic, sets in and all those kind of things. That's obviously a hallmark and the foundation for distance training and distance running. But if you are really efficient in terms of how you use elastic energy, your performance is going to go to another level again.
Well, that's it. And I think people forget that, talking about decent distance runners, rate of force development is actually still really important.
Oh, it's extremely important.
Ground contact times are still actually very short.
Yeah, they're all under 0.15. So you're still moving at really, really high speeds, relative in terms of, how much time you spend on the ground.
Yeah.
And, but this has been known for a long time. So Australia is very lucky because we have very good sports science researchers. And you've got people like Philo Saunders, for instance, who's been based at the AIS for a long time. And Dr. Saunders showed in the early 2000s, like the addition of plyometrics really started to affect running economy and improve performance in distance runners over, I think it was like 5K distance, really quickly. And that came, off the back of people consistently saying, oh, distance runners don't need to do strength work. They don't need to do plyometrics. They don't need to do anything other than run. And it's just not true. And Philo's, a really successful distance coach as well. And he's shown consistently that the application of those kind of additional training modalities are super helpful for distance training and for distance performance. I think that the evidence is pretty clear, and it's a bit of a moot point now that you shouldn't be doing sort of resistance training. You shouldn't be doing sort of, elastic tasks like plyometrics if you're a distance runner. It's also going to be protective. And I think we spoke about that briefly at the start, but that's huge. If you can create someone who has better running economy and is more robust, which means that they can do more of the volume of the distance training that they want to do, you're in a great position. And the other big benefit that you get, I guess, for distance running, because one of the main issues that sets them back is obviously bone health and, the significant number of bone stress injuries that are common in distance running. We know the resistance training, and particularly high velocity resistance training and high ground reaction forces are going, with things like plyometrics, are actually going to increase bone density.
Yeah.
So it's going to be protective.
Well, and I'd even extend that to thinking about metabolic functional capacity. I know we've talked about this a bit before, but the potential metabolic dysfunction you get from doing chronic long-term aerobic training, because it's essentially just this catabolic
do you want to explain that more? I know there's a paper that we shared within the group about like some of the ongoing, oxidative stress and metabolic stress that you get.
Yeah, well, talking about bioenergetics 101, thinking about the aerobic system, you're using oxidative oxidative energy systems, which utilizes the mitochondria predominantly. And so for distance runners, they obviously develop high capacity in doing this. In fact, one of the key adaptations you'll get from aerobic training is mitochondrial biogenesis, so an accumulation of mitochondria. But from any mechanical stimulus, you're going to get an increase in oxidative stress, and that's often secreted from the mitochondria or the cytosol of the cell. And that's actually a normal process. You need oxidative stress. It's actually a signal to allow adaptation to occur. And we have systems in our body that neutralize those oxidative stress markers, things like superoxide dismutase and so on, to make sure that there's balance within the system. Because if we have a very oxidative stress state for long periods of time, that's associated with chronic health. And one of the things it's associated with is metabolic dysfunction. And in fact, there is some research, I think you shared the paper a while back, of looking at the potential implications of long-term aerobic training causing mitochondrial dysfunction. I actually haven't read too much into that, but I'm assuming...
It's funny because I've always thought about this quite a bit. So I've actually noticed that a lot of distance runners, and very good distance runners, like obviously in the athletics community, you've got people who are marathon runners that represent the country. They often don't have very good health when they get older. And that to me was always a strange finding. They often have heart disease, or they have, they put on a lot of weight. And some of that obviously may be dietary, because they get used to eating a certain diet or whatever it is. But it never made sense to me that the amount of aerobic training they did wasn't protective in the long term, until I read this, when I thought, oh, okay, that makes sense, because the stimulus that they're getting is probably so much metabolic dysfunction over time that their system has actually, been depleted in its capability of dealing with some of those stresses.
And the other thing I think of too is people always associate marathon runners as being healthy because they've got low fat mass, which typically they do. They also have low muscle mass. And if we look at one of the key
markers of health for long term,
lifestyle factors for health, whether it's just like all-cause mortality, chronic diseases, it's the amount of muscle mass you have. It goes back to the point I made before of distance running or doing aerobic training is catabolic in nature.
It eats up muscle tissue.
Well, and again, it makes a lot of sense because you actually have a particular ratio you need to maintain of vascularization relative to the amount of myofibers you have. That's why doing distance running doesn't cause hypertrophy. It will typically reduce the amount of muscle mass so you can actually increase the capillary density and therefore maximize oxygen delivery to the muscle.
From the standpoint of utilizing resistance training, what's it going to do, you think, to at a metabolic level in terms of maintaining the ability to manage oxidative stress?
Well, I actually wonder how much of it has to do with building up sensitivity of the system.
Yep.
I kind of look at it similar to, say, like insulin resistance, using that as an example, where if you're someone who is constantly eating hypercaloric diet and typically a poor diet, you're flooding your system with insulin all the time and you actually build up resistance. And this is the hallmark for developing things like type 2 diabetes, but metabolic syndrome, which is associated with essentially all chronic disease. And I wonder if the issue has to do with lack of diversity of how you stress the metabolic system, where you're just applying the same type of stressor, which for the untrained person's okay.
It's good for them.
It's going to be really beneficial.
They're not being exposed to it day in, day out, twice a day sort of thing.
But for the elite athlete who's been distance running for 20, 30 years, not only have you capped out the ability to enhance that system, or
you're close to your limit.
Close to the limit. You've also essentially lost robustness, so to speak, or
with how it deals with that overall stress.
Correct, particularly if you have not applying any other type of stresses like resistance training. And so, it probably just reinforces the benefit of resistance training for distance runners too, of thinking about how it potentially enhances metabolic function. I'm not sure if anything's been looked into that, but
well, the thing that I often think about too is the hormonal effect and the benefits that you potentially get in distance runners, because obviously one of the major and it's particularly apparent in female athletes. But one of the big problems you have is obviously, previously it was called, the female athlete triad, and now it's probably more considered, REDS is the term that gets used. But I often think that that's, in my mind at least, and obviously, people are much more versed in this than I am, but it's clearly, causes a significant amount of hormonal disruption. And one of the things that I think is very clear is that a high volume of training and a lot of aerobic training tends to disrupt that much more than resistance training, unless the volume of resistance training is similarly high, like it could be with a distance runner. So I think one of the things that I always think about is how much benefit hormonally it may give to a female distance runner for them being able to maintain, say, something like a healthy menstruation, because they're actually not in this state where their hormonal system is depleted because of the volume of distance running they're doing.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense too when you think about anabolic hormones, or all the androgen and
how do you even
androgenic?
Yeah, that's androgenic.
Hormones, which are actually associated with things like
fertility,
and essentially your state of fertility is reflective of your health status.
Yeah.
So like you think about females with, say, REDs who
lose their menstruation. Yeah,
it's reflective of that, isn't it? So, actually, I haven't really looked into that specifically about whether there's a higher prevalence in aerobic athletes.
No, it'd actually be interesting to see if there's. I'm sure there probably is any research on whether application of things like resistance training, how much effect that one has on hormonal profile in, say, an endurance athlete, and then potentially what effect that has on things like RED symptoms, including menstruation.
Well, and it makes sense from this. If you're creating an anabolic stimulus and you're maintaining certain muscle mass, they are both going to be positively associated with better fertility and typically better health. Because again, going back to thinking about how muscle mass is so important, and not to mention just thinking about muscle mass as a secretory organ, because apart from its ability to produce higher amounts of force when you contract that tissue, it secretes a lot of cytokines that essentially have an impact on every system of the body, including the endocrine system.
I've just thought of this now, and I don't know the answer, so this is completely a hypothesis. But I think one of the things that to me is interesting is with REDs, it seems like a lot of what's being done is heavily related to food. People think, it's just not eating enough. But I don't actually think that that's necessarily, just based on this discussion, I don't know that that's the only thing. It's just that obviously if you increase your caloric intake, it's anabolic. So potentially you're getting the benefits of having more food because it's actually starting to change some of the expression of those anabolic hormones. Is reducing potentially your cortisol level, which, as we know, that's coupled with testosterone ratio. I don't know, like I'm probably going down a path that I don't know enough about, and asking questions that have probably been answered elsewhere. But it just makes me think about that, because I know that one of the key ways that people try and address RED symptoms is, you've got to eat more. Well, and I don't know that to me, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're addressing the underlying driver, which may actually be this metabolic dysfunction from an overtraining sort of, and overutilization of one particular type of training.
Well, the other thing I think of, and you might be able to shine some light on this, is there an issue with trying to be at race weight too much of the season? Because I know we've talked about this with some of your athletes before.
There is, and I think that's really important. And that's about basically just periodizing your food plan. Like in high periods of training and training volume, you obviously want to be in a caloric surplus. In periods where you're trying to get closer to your race weight and your training volumes and intensities may be maintained or whatever, but your volumes are going down, you probably don't need as many calories. And naturally throughout a race season, you're going to drop some weight anyway, because the amount of the actual stimulus that you're creating actually tends to do that. And maintaining that for longer is probably, a good thing. I think one of the things that athletes have problems with is they get attached to the physical appearance. It can be very dangerous for both, women and men. They like looking lean, they like looking cut. It's visually appealing, but it's probably not the healthiest state to be in for really long periods of time. You probably only want to be there for a couple of weeks and then come back out of it. So,
particularly if you associate that with success as well.
Well, it's probably when you're going to perform your best.
Yeah.
So you sort of feel like you want to be in that state, and it's probably not possible. But generally, what I think you find is people will stay lean if the balance of training is correct and the balance of caloric intake is correct. If it's out where you're overtraining, often people it's funny, people often get fat when they're overtraining, right? And it's because they're in a very high stress state. And so their body is trying to find ways to, maintain some sort of energy output.
Well, it triggers a lot of the energy to be converted into fat mass because it's that sort of evolutionary trait of like, I'm in a stressful state, don't know what the future is, I better store energy for the unknown times.
That's why you often see, like, if you see a distance runner, and I've noticed it probably more in females. You see in a distance runner, a female distance runner who looks a little bit, like you would think, they would probably be leaner than that.
Yeah.
Given the volume of running, they're doing 100 plus Ks a week. It's often because clearly they're overdoing it. And they might be eating the right amount, might not be too much or too little, but actually they're overtraining. And so there is that hormonal dysfunction that's occurring, that's driving. Again, yeah. And so interestingly, you often get those red symptoms. And I've had probably disagreements with people in the dietetics world around this because they'll say, it's because they're not eating enough. They need to eat more. And it's like, well, they're probably eating the right amount. It's just their training's fucking stupid. Like they're doing too much for the current capability they have, or maybe, as we've said, like potentially they're not actually having variation in what the metabolic system is having to do within the training, and you're overcooking that one aspect, so their system is not tolerating it very well.
Yeah, and I also think, is it because of a calorie deficiency or a nutrient deficiency? Like, because that's the other issue you have too when you start to restrict how much you're eating because you're trying to cut weight. Do you actually have enough nutrient density in the foods that you have to?
Well, that tends to be one of the problems, I think. And we're getting into an area now that obviously we have to say neither of us are experts in this, and it's not our area. But I think you would say that generally, this is a vast generalization, that distance runners obviously need the consumption of carbohydrates to maintain the amount of training that they do. However, if you eat mostly carbohydrates, there's often, there are some things that are high, very high in terms of nutrient density, but not the same as, foods that have, carbohydrates, fats and proteins all within that actual structure. So, it's hard, I think, for them to be able to get the right amount of calories in, but also, as you said, the right amount of nutrient density.
Yeah. And look, again, we probably really should get a dietitian on here to have a conversation.
I guess this is probably, it's highlighting what we don't know, and we probably... we should organise one of the someone to talk to and educate us, because it's not an area of strength, I would say.
Well, the other thing I think of too is the absence of potentially of animal protein or lack of animal protein when you think about nutrient density, but we'll leave that for another conversation. Yeah,
I think one of the things that, again, and this is one of the areas where it's starting to cross over, I think, into the realm of injuries is things like collagen. It's become very popular for people to take collagen for tendon health.
Yeah.
And what that demonstrates, where does the collagen come from? Well, collagen typically comes from animal products, and it comes from animal products that are high in connective tissue structure. So if you're not eating foods that are high in those, then you're probably not getting enough collagen.
Well, and this is the thing. It's like if there are certain cultural beliefs about not reducing animal protein because you think it's bad or it's unhealthy or whatever it is, let alone eating, say, how many people eat, brisket or lamb shanks?
Yeah, things that have a lot of a lot of connective tissue in them, skin, all that kind of stuff. Like people
make your own bone broth.
Yeah, people are not. Well, some people do, and obviously
that's true.
People enjoy that process. But unless you're getting those foods in relatively regularly, you're probably not getting. Not that you're not getting enough, but you're probably not getting as much collagen as you would as if you were eating those foods. And that's therefore why, obviously, it would be interesting to see whether, because of those changes, the advent of collagen supplements has become so vast, particularly for connective tissue problems like tendons, whether this was, this is a problem of now.
Well, this is something that I do know about collagen specifically, is collagen hasn't got a lot of attention because it's a non-essential amino acid. It's made of predominantly glycine and proline, which you can synthesize. But recently it's been classified as a conditional or semi-essential amino acid, or the acids, those two, because although your body can synthesize it, if you have a diet that's low in collagen, the amount that your body produces is lower compared to someone who has a diet high in collagen. So the reality is we've clearly developed mechanisms to be able to create the amino acids that build collagen during periods where we couldn't access it. But generally speaking, it seems that we need to make sure we consume enough through food, and particularly too where we've moved away from eating, say, tough cuts of meat or organs or bones, which are the high collagen parts of the animal, and we eat more the lean cuts in terms of like the chicken breast or the steak, we're more likely to have that deficiency.
Yeah. As I said, I think it's interesting. And obviously, I'm sure, I don't know whether we'll be criticized for talking about some of this nutritional stuff, but...
Well, this is not dietary advice.
No. But the thing that I think is interesting about it is there seems to be a big crossover that's starting to happen with this, particularly, if you look at even the research and the supplements that were developed through the AIS studies around, say, like tendon pain, and how they found the utilization of collagen, particularly if it has vitamin C within it, has a big effect on the repair that occurs from loading, and the application of loads to tendon structures for, say, tendon healing.
Yeah, and look, I don't know if we talked about this, but a paper I recently shared with the clinic here and did a presentation on is understanding the role of metabolic stress and tendon adaptations. And so there's a bit of research coming out now looking at, say, blood flow restriction, where you're creating a high amount of metabolic stress even though the mechanical tension is low, because typically the actual intensity of the weights you use is quite low, but create adaptations in the patella and Achilles tendon. And this is due to the accumulation of things like lactate in particular. But it highlights too that tissue, and particularly connective tissue, is very responsive to metabolic stress. And I wonder if part of the equation that's missing, and it's certainly supported when you look at some of Keith Barr's work, is yes, you need to think about the mechanical loads that you apply to induce certain adaptations in the tendon, but do you actually have the appropriate building blocks to allow that tendon to adapt?
Yeah.
And we know that the actual, because tendon and connective tissue typically is has much lower metabolic capacity, it's not as metabolically active. The window and timing of the consumption of these nutrients with loading connective tissue structures is really important. And so it seems that half the equation...
Just so for people listening, like when should you be consuming these products?
Yes, this is from Keith Barr's work of looking at consuming collagen prior to loading. Typically they did an hour before they did a loading regimen. And the whole basis or premise of it is thinking about connective tissues like tendons as a sponge. So when you load it, you essentially squeeze all the fluid out of it. And that also creates certain changes in the tissue properties that are advantageous to performance. As you relax, it's going to draw fluid back in from the interstitium. So if you time it appropriately where you consume collagen and allow it to break down and allow the
be within your actual tissue. Yeah, would be within the tissue by that time.
To be in the blood, it's going to be taken up by the tissue and allow it to build new tissue essentially, or remodel the tissue. And it's interesting, it hasn't actually been done yet, but I actually wonder if we need to be thinking the same about joint tissue as well.
Yep.
Because it essentially follows the same thing of fluid mobilization to draw in nutrients to the joint.
Yeah, I think that actually will be the new frontier, because we're starting to see even products. I know that we've spoken about the idea of like type 2 collagen being used for, say, like cartilage regrowth.
Absolutely.
Which is obviously a major issue that you face in, particularly degradation of joint structures over time in sport, or people who've had, say, some sort of chondral injury or something like that, whether you can actually start to change that. Because I know that those papers that you shared with us from Keith have the amount of change that you can see within a tendon structure by getting the loading appropriately done, but also doing it in an environment, as you said, where there's the appropriate building blocks. You can actually see significant change within the tendon structure.
Yeah. And this is actually quite a controversial topic, because I know a lot of people in a lot of the tendon research gurus will say you can't change the tissue structure, particularly the degenerative part that's typically in the center. But there's some case studies that Keith Barr's showing now where they've found you can actually see structural remodeling.
It was over like about a 50-day period, wasn't it?
Yeah, with it was a basketball player, I'm pretty sure, an elite basketball player. And I mean, it kind of makes sense in a way, because I think of, even if, say, you rupture a tendon, like, it can remodel. I mean, you may need surgery to bring the ends together, but even still, if there's not that much displacement, clearly there's remodeling occurring to allow it to heal and mend back together. So I don't see why we should think about any tissue structure not having the ability to remodel to an extent. Now we need to think about the actual tissue and think about its ability to go through mitosis or replicate, because we know that, for instance, muscles have much larger capacity to replicate than, say, cartilage. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't have some ability to, if given the right environment, potentially. But
upregulate telomerase.
Yeah.
All right. I think we've hit on a number of topics there. Hopefully that was helpful for people. I'm sure we'll probably talk about running again. If people do have areas of interest when it comes to running that they want to hear more about, we'd be more than happy to sort of answer some questions or go through some things. So, send them through our social media channels, comment on our YouTube channel, or send us an email, admin at melbourneathleticdevelopment.com.au.
Yeah, I mean, something we actually haven't discussed much about yet, but we do try to put a lot of stuff on social media, and happy to contact or connect with people who have found some of the stuff interesting or want to discuss things further or want any resources from us.
Obviously, you can tell we like talking, so if you want to talk with us or share anything, please do so.